I'm Sierra Urich. I'm the director of Joonam, which is a personal film about myself, my mother, and my grandmother, and each of our relationships to Iran. I grew up in Bristol in Vermont, and they grew up in Iran, and so it's this three-generational mother-daughter immigration story.
I've been chatting with several folks now, and your doc, there's another doc who, I feel like every first project is personal, to someone, but this is really personal. It's your family. It's one thing, and I know, I'm fascinated and I want to talk a little more about how you explored your own identity as Iranian American without being there, being a part of that. But it's one thing to kind of have these conversations around the kitchen table. It's another to put it on film and have the world to see. How did you make that step, not leap, but step from wanting to talk about this with your family to saying, you know what, I want everybody to see this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I come from an art background. I studied painting and drawing in school, and then I ended up studying film. And so I've always kind of processed the world through the art that I make.
Right.
And so my mom called me one evening. I was actually at an art residency working on something completely different. And my grandmother was visiting my mom at the time, and she was starting to share with my mom all these stories that my mom had never heard about her mom in this region of northern Iran when she was a preteen woman getting married on the night of her first menstruation.
Wow.
And so my mom calls me that evening saying, I'm hearing all these stories for the first time about Grandma, you've got to hear this stuff. And so I was at this residency when she called me, and so I thought, I should really be going home and recording these stories with my grandmother, not at this art residency.
Posterity.
For posterity, for myself. Maybe it'll be an interesting piece because I'm an artist and that's how I think about things naturally. And so the impetus was really just to go home to hear these stories from my grandmother, and maybe it would become some sort of three-generational exploration of girlhood. But I had no idea that it would turn into what it became, and that it would become about me exploring my own identity, and that things would get so raw. And so that really, all of that stuff materialized through the process.
When you started to move into that area, was it difficult to keep your mother and your grandmother engaged with the project on a trust factor?
There's definitely a level of building trust in everything. I think I thought going in that I would just have the trust unequivocally because they're my family.
Right.
But there's a camera there, and the camera is this promise of a future audience watching the film that you're making. And so we had a lot of conversations around that, less so about not trusting me, but more what is this future audience gonna think, and an extra level when you're coming from a country that has an authoritarian regime, it's also a matter of safety of, depending on what's out there, will that endanger family members that I have back home? Will that imperil any possibility I have returning home? So it was a constant conversation about what can and can't be shown, and sometimes conflict. And I wanted to show something my family didn't, or vice versa.
It's a story about family, but there are geopolitical implications inherently because of Iran and the United States. Your mother and grandmother seem like they have very different relationships with their home.
Well, they're coming from two different perspectives. My mother left in her 20s for college thinking that she would come back. It wasn't really a situation where she was fleeing. She thought, I'm going to go to school. She went to UMass Amherst. And I'll come back in the summers and visit. And things are kind of rocky at home right now, so it's better that I leave anyways, not knowing that the country would completely change. And my grandmother is coming from a very different perspective, but she's an incredibly spiritual woman. Her faith was really important to her, so she was always kind of approaching Iran from a religious history as well that she had a lot of pride in. And then my mom is kind of caught in between. She's a daughter to her mother, but she's also a mother to me. And so it's not just about the loss of the land for her, but also wanting to protect me.
Protect you. So she's literally in the middle.
Between
the two generations. What was it like, as a first-time director of a documentary feature? I think could be daunting, but to also then have it be your family watching you do this work. I mean, in one way, it's like, okay, you have the most forgiving audience. It's your family, but in the other, I can only. I mean, just watching your grandmother on film, she seems like a natural director herself.
Yes.
So what? How was that, having the experience of doing this for the first time with your family there?
There's a line in the film when my grandmother is saying, it's like, or maybe it's my mother, now I'm forgetting. I've seen the film so many times, it's incredible that I could even forget. But that were her instruments.
Right.
And I think they really were my guinea pigs in a lot of ways. It was such a forgiving environment because I had this unconditional love of my family. But there was that dynamic where my mother and my grandmother are both very strong-willed people. And so we were all vying for the role of director at some point with the film of, my mother is more camera shy, so she was like, oh, don't film me right now, I'm not ready. And my grandmother was very, she just was a magnet to the camera, and she was like, what are you doing over there? Film me, I'm over here. Like, why are you pointing the camera in that direction? So there was constantly this sort of unspoken battle about what is being filmed and who's directing the shot. But it was, ultimately it was the best way to learn how to make a film because you can slip up with your family and they'll forgive you in a way that's, someone else won't.
So it's an international film, but it's rooted in Bristol, in this little community in Vermont, which obviously someone who's lived here for a couple of decades loves that. And I think it's it's part of the story too, right? I mean, what you know is Bristol, Vermont. What you want to know, but you can't without being there, is Iran. And as you said, this, dislocation for your identity. Can you tell me about the role of place in your movie?
Yeah, I found myself filming a lot in nature, and sometimes as an artist you go into a project knowing exactly why you're doing something and exactly what it's going to be, and you just execute.
Right.
And there's other projects where you're kind of discovering yourself in the process of making it, and this was definitely the latter.
Right.
And so in the edit, I was like, all this footage of the land, what was I? I was wasting hours of footage just shooting the seasons passing. And then it really struck me that connection to land is so important as Vermonters, and connection to nature, and growing up here, that's very much a part of who I am. But it's also about my disconnection to the land of Iran.
Exactly.
Because my mom, she did so much actually when I was growing up to try and give me the culture. She tried to teach me the language, but I wasn't really interested.
Right.
She hosted a ton of events actually in Bristol and Addison County, sort of teaching and being an ambassador for her country to Vermont. But she couldn't give me Iran, which is what I really wanted. And being able to step foot in that land myself and make my own personal connection to it, not necessarily through her, but just directly.
By yourself.
She couldn't give me that.
Right.
And so I think so much of the land and place is embedded in this film because it's about that duality of the deep connection to the land of Vermont and the desire, the longing for the same connection to the land of Iran.
So as you're having this journey as a filmmaker, you're having your own personal journey that are, perhaps running parallel, perhaps crossing. The film, so you have a finished product with the film, but where are you as a person with this with this journey?
Yeah, well, I still don't speak Farsi fluently, unfortunately. The reality is, if you're not practicing constantly and you're embedded in a community that speaks it, it's a ton of work to learn a new language.
Right.
So I think that's going to be a lifelong practice for me. And, after I was done filming, it was such an intense period of shooting, even just emotions aside. Physically, it's so intense to be filming all the time, and then you add on the layer of spending every day with family, and it's an exhausting process.
Right.
And so it was really in the editing that I was rediscovering elements that I didn't know about. Even, very basic, getting the transcripts back for the translations.
Right.
while I was shooting, I didn't know what my grandmother was saying or my mom when they were having conversations between them. I knew the subject matter roughly,
Right.
but I didn't know the nuances. And so 6 months down the road, I'm getting these translations back bit by bit,
Right.
and I'm finding out, oh, actually in this scene they were talking about me and I was standing right there and I had no idea, you know. Or I'm understanding my grandmother for the first time and she's making a joke and she's
Right.
not just this caricature of loving grandma.
Right.
She's witty and she's funny and she's saying these really touching things and I had no idea and
She's
I
her
was
own
standing
person.
right there.
Right.
It was like discovering a completely new person and then kind of like rediscovering my relationship to it in a new way.
What has the reaction been, both from, I mean, I can imagine there are those who have known you and are now seeing, you know, new sides of you, new sides of your mom, and those maybe who haven't known you but have had similar questions. I mean, how have audiences responded?
Audiences have really loved the film. I think it's been playing on multiple levels for people. The Iranian audiences feel so seen.
Right.
Especially children of immigrants or like second generation who maybe are dealing with the same thing that I was dealing with my family.
Right.
And then a lot of people have connected to my mom who are of her generation of, you know, I want to be able to give this to my child, but I feel like I can't, or it's a gray area of like how much I can give to someone or not. And then there's people who aren't Iranian at all and see themselves in the parent-child relationship or their mother-daughter relationship, who are like, oh, I've had that same fight with my mom in the kitchen, you know, or just really relating to that, I think, inherent desire as a child to want independence from your family and create your own identity, and then the parental, you know, desire to protect one's child and like give them so much, but you ultimately can't give them everything.
Of course. Oh, that's amazing, and it makes sense that people, you know, like in the audience, will take in what they're viewing, but also kind of add their own patina to it based on their life experience. So I don't want to take you out of the now. I mean, you should, you know, you've worked so hard on this, and you have this wonderful film that people are enjoying. But is your mind thinking about, okay, what's next for me? What's my next project?
It's definitely, you know, when you're in a project, at least I'm this way, speaking for myself, it's so hard for me to separate from what I'm doing right now, especially as an independent filmmaker. You're wearing so many hats all the time. There's like so little money. You're trying to make something on a shoestring that I had no capacity to think of the next project while I was in it. And everyone was telling me, make sure you have the next thing lined up. And now things are starting to open up in my mind a little bit more, where I can dream a little bit about what I want to do next. And so it's definitely, I'm in the development phase of a couple of ideas, but taking it slow and trying to really shepherd this film into the world and do it justice.
As you should. I mean, it's you know, it's one of those things where you work so hard and you don't want to move on too quickly, because then you're not really experiencing the finished product and allowing others to as well. So, well, thank you. This has been wonderful, and it's nice to. I know this is home for you, so it's nice to be able to you know, showcase your work in a community that has nurtured you.
I'm so excited to share it with the local community. All
bet.
of our friends and neighbors are coming. Everyone's
That's
really
amazing.
excited, so it's awesome to be here.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thanks
so much.